In the far reaches of the galaxy, where diplomatic protocols are written in blood and bone, humanity has earned a reputation that makes even the most hardened alien warriors whisper in fear. They call us the Bone Menders, not because we heal, but because we break first, then fix what we've broken with our bare hands. What they don't understand is that sometimes the greatest act of violence can also be the greatest act of mercy. Sometimes, to save a life, you must first appear to be taking it. This is the story of how one human's terrifying display of raw strength became the foundation of the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. It's about the moment when monster and savior became the same word, spoken by the same trembling voice. The transport shuttle Meridian's Hope cut through the void like a silver needle threading cosmic fabric. Inside its cramped passenger compartment, 3 beings sat in uncomfortable silence, each representing their respective species in what the Galactic Council had optimistically termed a routine diplomatic exchange. Commander Sarah Chen adjusted her position in the human-sized seat, her dark eyes scanning the mission briefing for the 100th time. Across from her, Ambassador Zexalthara of the crystalline hegemony sat rigid as carved ice, her translucent blue skin catching the shuttle's artificial lighting in prismatic rainbows. The crystalline being's 4 arms were folded in what humans had learned was a gesture of deep contemplation among her people. Her species communicated partially through harmonic resonances that vibrated through their silicon-based bodies, creating a constant low humming that most other species found either soothing or deeply unsettling. The third passenger, Trade Minister Voxakar of the Thorin Collective, occupied a specially reinforced section of the shuttle. His massive, bear-like frame was covered in coarse brown fur, and his species' reputation for both incredible strength and short tempers preceded them throughout known space. Unlike the ethereal crystallines, the Thorins were as grounded and practical as granite mountains. They spoke in growls and barks that their universal translators converted into surprisingly eloquent Standard Galactic. Sarah had been chosen for this mission precisely because of humanity's newest reputation in galactic politics. Just 50 years after first contact, humans had somehow managed to position themselves as mediators in disputes across the galaxy. It wasn't because they were particularly wise or diplomatic, quite the opposite actually. Humans had earned respect through a series of incidents that other species could only describe as beautifully terrifying displays of practical problem-solving. The Zephyrian blockade incident was still talked about in hushed tones. When 3 different species had locked themselves in a trade dispute that threatened to destabilize an entire sector, human negotiators had simply loaded a cargo ship with representatives from all sides, launched it toward a dying star, and announced that they would all figure out their differences on the way back, or they wouldn't be coming back at all. The remarkable thing wasn't that it worked, but that all 3 species had later requested human mediators for future disputes. Commander Chen? Zexalthara's voice came through the translator as a melodious chime, though Sarah could hear the underlying harmonic nervousness. I must admit concern about our destination. The border worlds have been unstable since the mining rights dispute began. Voxkar's massive head turned toward the crystalline ambassador, his black eyes reflecting an intelligence that many species underestimated. Unstable is diplomatic language. The correct term is actively hostile. 3 merchant vessels have gone missing in that sector in the past month. Sarah nodded, setting down her datapad.
Which is exactly why we need to be there.
The hegemony and the collective have been circling each other like wary predators for 6 months. The longer this goes on, the more likely it becomes that someone fires the first shot. And then? Zexalthara asked, though her harmonic undertones suggested she already knew the answer. Then we have a war, Sarah replied simply. A war over mining rights to a handful of asteroids that, frankly, neither of your species actually needs. The hegemony has crystal farms that produce more valuable materials per cubic meter than those asteroids could yield in a century. The collective has enough raw materials stockpiled to last 3 generations. Voxkar's rumbling laugh shook the shuttle's cabin. You speak truth, human, but you do not understand pride. The collective cannot be seen to back down from crystalline intimidation. And the hegemony cannot appear weak before Thorin aggression, Zexalthara added, her own harmonics taking on a defensive edge. Our colonies look to us for protection.
Sarah leaned back in her seat, studying both ambassadors.
This was the heart of the problem, and she'd seen it in dozens of conflicts across the galaxy. Species would rather fight and die than lose face, even when the thing they were fighting over had no real value. Humans had the same tendency, but they also had a peculiar talent for cutting through the elaborate social protocols that other species used to justify their stubbornness. "Let me ask you both something," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone that her diplomatic instructors had called deceptively casual. "What's the worst thing that could happen if your species simply walked away from this dispute?" Zelthahara's harmonics shifted to what Sarah recognized as confusion. "Walk away? Commander, that is not how diplomatic disputes are resolved. There are protocols, negotiation frameworks, mediation procedures. Your people would think us cowards," Foxes growled, though his tone suggested he'd considered the option. "Thorin's strength is not shown through retreat." "Right," Sarah said. "So you'd rather spend the next 5 years, thousands of lives, and billions of credits fighting over rocks that you don't need, because walking away might hurt your feelings." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Both ambassadors stared at the human, and Sarah could practically see them processing her words through their cultural filters. This was what made humans effective mediators. They had an almost supernatural ability to strip away the elaborate justifications that civilized species wrapped around their base instincts. Voxcar was the first to speak. "You oversimplify, human." "Do I?" Sarah asked. "Because from where I sit, this looks like two groups of adults fighting over a toy that neither of them really wants, just because someone else might get it." Zeg Zalthara's harmonics took on a sharp, almost angry edge. "Commander Chen, such language is hardly diplomatic." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "It's not diplomatic, it's honest. And in my experience, honesty tends to solve problems faster than diplomacy." The shuttle's intercom crackled to life. "Passengers, this is Captain Morrison. We're approaching the Kepler Station orbital facility. Please prepare for docking procedures. I should warn you that we've detected several military vessels in the area, both hegemony and collective flags. Situation looks tense down there." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Military vessels meant that both sides were moving beyond mere posturing. If shooting started while they were on station, their diplomatic immunity would be worth about as much as vacuum. "How many ships?" she called toward the cockpit. "Hegemony's got a crystal cruiser and 2 escort frigates holding position at the outer marker," Morrison replied. "Collective showing a heavy assault carrier and 4 support vessels at the inner perimeter. They're not targeting each other yet, but they're definitely not here for the scenic views." Voxcar's massive hands clenched into fists. The hegemony brought a cruiser to a negotiation. "This is preparation for battle." The collective deployed an assault carrier, Zek-Selthara countered, her harmonics rising to an almost musical shriek.
"Your people speak of preparation for war." "Both of you stop," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through their rising anger.
"This is exactly the kind of thinking that starts wars. You see their ships and assume hostile intent. They see your ships and assume the same thing. Meanwhile, nobody actually wants to fight." "You cannot know that," Voxcar rumbled. "Actually, I can," Sarah said. "Because if either of your species actually wanted war, you wouldn't have agreed to this mediation. You'd have just started shooting 6 months ago." The shuttle shuddered slightly as docking clamps engaged. Through the small porthole, Sarah could see Kepler Station's central hub, a massive cylinder of metal and ceramic that housed one of the galaxy's most important neutral trading posts. The station existed in a carefully maintained no-man's land between hegemony and collective space, administered by a consortium of smaller species who profited from their neutrality. "We're docked," Morrison announced. "Station commander says they've prepared a conference room in the diplomatic section. Also says that they're running on emergency protocols due to the military presence. All civilians have been evacuated to the inner sections." Sarah stood and gathered her belongings. "Gentlemen, lady, we're about to walk into a room where the wrong word could start a war that neither of your peoples wants. I need you both to remember something." Both ambassadors looked at her expectantly. "You're not here representing your species' pride or your military strength or your historical grievances," Sarah continued. "You're here representing millions of individuals who want to live their lives, raise their children, and not get blown up because their leaders couldn't figure out how to share some rocks." She moved toward the airlock, then paused and looked back. "And if you can't remember that, remember this. I've studied the tactical reports from both of your fleets. If shooting starts, everybody dies. Your cruiser can crack the collective carrier, but not before their assault pods gut your escorts. The carrier can overwhelm the hegemony formation, but those crystal weapons will turn it into expanding plasma before it can celebrate. There are no winners in this fight, just varying degrees of loss." The airlock cycled open, revealing a sterile corridor lined with beings from a dozen different species. All of them looked nervous, and Sarah could see why. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, and she could hear the distant hum of military communications channels through the station's comm system. As they walked through the diplomatic quarter, Sarah noticed that they weren't alone. Other mediation teams moved through the corridors, species that specialized in conflict resolution, trade dispute arbitration, and resource allocation negotiations. The galaxy's entire peaceful problem-solving apparatus had converged on this single point, because everyone understood what was at stake. "Commander," Zexelthara said quietly as they approached the conference room, "may I ask why humans choose to involve themselves in such disputes? Your species has no claim to these resources, no territorial interest in our border regions." Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she'd been asked dozens of times by dozens of species, and she still wasn't sure she had a good answer. "Because," she said finally, "humans have a saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've learned that it's much easier to stop wars from starting than to clean up the mess afterward." Voxcar snorted. "Your species has been in space for barely 50 years. What do you know of war?" Sarah stopped walking and turned to face the massive Thorin. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made both ambassadors step back involuntarily. "Minister Voxgar, my species spend most of our recorded history perfecting the art of killing each other over resources, territory, ideology, and pride. We got very, very good at it. Good enough that we nearly destroyed our own planet several times over. We learned to mediate disputes not because we're naturally peaceful, but because we're naturally very good at violence. We know exactly where this path leads, and we know that nobody really wants to go there." The conference room doors slid open ahead of them, revealing a circular chamber dominated by a holographic display showing the disputed asteroid field. Representatives from both sides were already seated at opposite ends of the room, their postures rigid with barely controlled hostility. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the room. Behind her, she could hear Zaxel-Thara's harmonics shift to a frequency she'd learned to associate with deep thought, while Voxcar's breathing had taken on the slow, measured pattern that Thorins used to control their famous tempers. The next few hours would determine whether this dispute ended with handshakes or with the flash of antimatter warheads. And Sarah Chen, representing a species that half the galaxy still considered barely civilized, was about to try to talk two ancient civilizations back from the brink of a war that would accomplish absolutely nothing except filling space with corpses. As she moved toward the mediator's position at the head of the conference table, Sarah allowed herself one moment of dark humor. Humanity's reputation for solving problems through terrifying displays of practical violence had opened doors throughout the galaxy. Now she just had to hope that her own particular talents would be enough to keep those doors from slamming shut on everyone's fingers. The real work was about to begin. The conference room fell silent as Sarah took her position at the central mediation console. The holographic display cast shifting shadows across the faces of the assembled delegates, each asteroid in the disputed field rotating slowly like a three-dimensional map of potential devastation. Around the curved table, 12 beings, representing two of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, stared at each other with barely concealed hostility. Fleet Admiral Kethmore of the Crystalline Hegemony sat with military precision, her crystalline form refracting light into sharp rainbows that seemed to cut through the air. Beside her, Chief Negotiator Yalseth maintained the harmonic breathing patterns that kept crystalline emotions in check, though Sarah could detect the subtle dissonance that indicated stress. The hegemony delegation occupied their section of the table like pieces on a chessboard, each position carefully calculated, each gesture measured for its political impact. Across from them, the Tharan Collective's representatives dominated their space through sheer physical presence. War Leader Gorthak was a mountain of muscle and fur, his scarred hands resting on the table like sledgehammers waiting to fall. Economic Minister Thexara, despite being the smallest member of the collective delegation, radiated an intensity that made even her own companions give her space. The Thorins had arranged themselves not as politicians but as a pack preparing for confrontation. Sarah activated her translator interface and began with the standard mediation protocols, knowing even as she spoke that standard wouldn't be enough here. This mediation session is officially convened under the auspices of the Galactic Council's Peaceful Resolution Framework. All parties have agreed to present their positions honestly and work toward a mutually beneficial solution. Mutually beneficial. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's translated voice carried the harmonic equivalent of a laugh. Commander Chen, the Thorin Collective has spent 6 months making increasingly aggressive claims to territory that has belonged to the hegemony for over 2 centuries. There is no mutual benefit to be found in rewarding territorial expansion through intimidation. War leader Gorth Ack's response came as a low growl that the translator converted into surprisingly formal Standard Galactic. The crystalline hegemony speaks of territorial claims while their mining operations strip resources from neutral space. They hide behind ancient treaties while they violate current law. Sarah pulled up the disputed territory data on her console, studying the overlapping claims and counterclaims that had brought two civilizations to the brink of war. The picture that emerged was depressingly familiar. A legal maze of century-old treaties, resource rights, mining permits and territorial agreements that contradicted each other at almost every point. "Let me make sure I understand the core issue," Sarah said, projecting a simplified map onto the main display. "These 17 asteroids contain rare crystal formations that both civilizations use in their technology. The hegemony claims historical mining rights based on treaties signed before the collective expanded into this sector. The collective claims current territorial sovereignty based on their recent colonization of nearby systems." Oversimplified, but essentially correct. Chief Negotiator Yalseth confirmed, her harmonics tight with barely controlled irritation. The hegemony had 2 centuries to establish permanent operations in this region. Economic Minister Thex Sara added, "Their failure to do so does not create eternal rights to resources they have never actually extracted." Sarah nodded and made notes on her console. Standard diplomatic procedure called for her to spend the next several hours letting each side present their complete legal arguments, followed by days of technical discussions about resource extraction, territorial sovereignty, and historical precedent. She'd mediated enough disputes to know that this approach would accomplish exactly nothing except giving both sides more time to refine their justifications for the war they'd already decided to fight. "Before we dive into the legal specifics," Sarah said, "I'd like to try something different. I want each delegation to explain why this particular dispute matters enough to risk the lives of millions of your people." The silence that followed was not the thoughtful pause of consideration, but the shocked quiet of beings who had never been asked to justify their positions in such direct terms. Fleet Admiral Kethmore was the first to respond. "Commander, the question shows a fundamental misunderstanding of interstellar relations. The hegemony cannot permit territorial aggression to succeed, regardless of the specific resources involved. To do so would invite further expansion attempts throughout our border regions." "So this isn't really about the asteroids," Sarah said. "This is about precedent. All diplomatic actions set precedent." Chief Negotiator Yalseth agreed. "The collective's expansion must be contained before it threatens core hegemony systems." Sarah turned to the Thorin delegation. War Leader Gorthak. Same question. "Why are these particular rocks worth a war?" The massive Thorin leaned forward, his chair creaking under the strain. "The collective claims no territory through aggression. These systems were empty when our colonies arrived. The hegemony seeks to control resources they have never used, in space they do not occupy, to prevent expansion they could easily accommodate. So, from your perspective, this is about the hegemony trying to control territory they don't actually use," Sarah summarized. "Precisely. They demand that we remain confined to our traditional space, while they reserve the right to claim anything that might someday be valuable to them." Sarah made more notes, watching the real problem take shape. Both sides were arguing about principles that had nothing to do with the actual resources in dispute. The hegemony saw Thorin expansion as an existential threat to their long-term security. The collective saw crystalline claims as an attempt to permanently contain their civilization's growth. Neither side cared about 17 chunks of rock floating in space. They cared about what those rocks represented. "Here's what I'm hearing," Sarah said, setting down her stylus and looking directly at each delegation in turn. "The hegemony is afraid that if they let the collective take these asteroids, it will encourage further Thorin expansion until their core systems are threatened. The collective is afraid that if they back down now, the hegemony will use legal technicalities to block future expansion indefinitely. Is that accurate?" The uncomfortable shifting around the table told her that her assessment had hit close to home. "Commander Chen," Chief Negotiator Yalseth said carefully, "you reduce complex geopolitical realities to oversimplified fears." "Actually," Sarah replied, "I think fears are exactly what's driving this situation. And they're not unreasonable fears. They're based on very real strategic concerns that both civilizations have legitimate reasons to worry about." She stood and moved to the holographic display, manipulating the controls to show a wider view of the region. "But here's what's interesting. Both of your fears are based on assumptions that may not be true." The display shifted to show trade routes, colony ships' movements, and resource extraction data for the past 50 years. Sarah had spent weeks studying the intelligence reports and economic analyses that the Galactic Council's diplomatic corps had compiled. Hegemony expansion of the past century has been focused on crystal farming and energy production, Sarah continued. Their new colonies have been established in systems with specific stellar conditions that maximize crystal formation. These asteroid fields don't actually contain the type of crystals that the hegemony's economy depends on. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's posture stiffened. The economic value of the resources is not the primary concern. Right, it's about precedent, Sarah agreed. But look at the collective's actual expansion pattern. The display shifted again, highlighting Thorin colony movements. Every new collective system has been chosen for specific strategic resources, heavy metals, rare earths, energy sources that support their manufacturing base. They're not expanding randomly or trying to surround hegemony space. They're following very predictable economic logic. War leader Gorthak's massive head tilted slightly, and Sarah caught the gesture that indicated intrigued attention among his species. You have studied our expansion planning. I've studied everyone's expansion planning, Sarah said. It's my job. And what I've found is that both of your civilizations are operating under strategic assumptions that made sense 200 years ago but don't match current realities. She manipulated the display to project forward 50 years, showing probable expansion routes based on known resource requirements and technological development trends. If both civilizations continue developing at current rates, using current technologies, and following current economic priorities, your expansion routes won't significantly overlap for at least the next century.
The silence that followed was different from the earlier hostility.
Sarah could see delegates on both sides studying the projections, cross-referencing her data with their own strategic planning. Commander, Economic Minister Thexara said slowly, these projections assume that technological development and resource requirements remain static. That is not a safe assumption for strategic planning. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed, which is why both civilizations should be talking about how to manage future expansion instead of fighting over territory that neither of you actually needs right now. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's harmonics shifted to a frequency that Sarah's cultural training identified as deep skepticism. You propose that two major civilizations base their security planning on optimistic assumptions about future cooperation. No, Sarah said. I propose that two major civilizations acknowledge that their current conflict is based on outdated assumptions about each other's intentions, and that they both have more to gain from cooperation than from warfare. She returned to her console and pulled up another display, casualty projections for a full-scale conflict between the hegemony and the collective. The numbers that appeared made several delegates visibly flinch. A war between your civilizations would kill approximately 47 million beings in the first year, Sarah said quietly. Infrastructure damage would set both economies back at least 2 decades. The strategic territories you're fighting to control would be so devastated by combat that they'd be worthless for at least a century. War leader Gorth stared at the projection with the expression of someone watching his worst nightmares made real. These numbers, they account for civilian casualties? They account for everything, Sarah replied. Military deaths, civilian casualties, economic collapse, supply chain disruption, colonial isolation, refugee displacement. The works. Chief Negotiator Yalseth's harmonics had dropped to a frequency so low it was barely audible. Commander, such projections are speculative. They assume total warfare rather than limited conflict. They assume that wars have a tendency to escalate beyond their original scope, Sarah corrected, which is what wars do. You start shooting over some asteroids, someone's ship gets destroyed, they retaliate against your supply convoys, you respond by hitting their colonies, they strike back at your industrial centers, and suddenly you're in a total war that nobody actually wanted. The conference room fell into a silence so complete that Sarah could hear the station's life support systems humming through the walls. Both delegations stared at the casualty projections with the kind of horrified fascination that numbers like these always inspired. Then alarms began blaring throughout the station. The main display automatically switched to external sensor feeds, showing the space around Kepler Station. Sarah's blood ran cold as she saw what had triggered the alerts. 3 more hegemony vessels had just dropped out of hyperspace, taking positions that put them in direct firing lines with the collective fleet. At the same time, 6 additional Thorin ships materialized at the outer system perimeter, their weapon systems already charging. Fleet Admiral, Chief Negotiator Yalseth's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. What are those ships doing here? Kethmore was already activating her comm unit, trying to reach her fleet commanders. I issued no orders for additional vessels. This deployment was not authorized by the Hegemony Military Command. War leader Gorthak was having similar difficulties reaching his own forces. Collective fleet doctrine prohibits unsanctioned reinforcement deployment. These ships should not be here. Sarah felt the familiar chill that always preceded disaster. She'd seen this pattern before in other conflicts. Local commanders who decided that their political leaders weren't being aggressive enough. Military units that took defensive actions that looked exactly like preparation for attack. Bureaucratic miscommunications that turned routine deployments into acts of war. How long before those fleets consider each other's positions an imminent threat? She asked. Fleet Admiral Kethmore checked her tactical displays. Crystalline doctrine calls for preemptive action when hostile forces achieve tactical advantage. Current positioning gives the collective fleet striking superiority. Thorin protocols require response to direct threat preparation. War leader Gorth acceded grimly. Hegemony crystal weapons at current range constitute preparation for system-wide bombardment. Sarah looked at the tactical display and realized that they had perhaps 20 minutes before someone fired the first shot. 20 minutes to either prevent or witness the beginning of a war that would kill millions of beings and accomplish absolutely nothing except satisfying the pride of species who had talked themselves into believing they had no choice but to fight. The mediation had just become a race against time, and Sarah Chen found herself standing at the exact point where peace and catastrophe balanced on a knife's edge. The station's emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows as Sarah stared at the tactical display. External feeds showed both fleets maneuvering into increasingly aggressive positions, their weapon systems cycling through pre-firing sequences that any military analyst would recognize as preparation for combat. The elegant dance of diplomacy had just crashed headlong into the brutal reality of military momentum. Station commander to conference room, the intercom crackled. We're showing weapons lock initiations from multiple vessels. Recommend immediate evacuation to secure sections. Sarah ignored the announcement and focused on the two military leaders who had just discovered that their carefully planned mediation was about to be decided by trigger-happy ship captains. Fleet Admiral Kethmore, can you contact your vessels directly? Kethmore's crystalline fingers moved over her comm console with desperate precision. Attempting contact with Fleet Commander Sithara aboard the cruiser Harmonic Convergence. She is not responding to priority diplomatic channels. War leader, same question. Garthik's massive hands worked his own console with surprising delicacy. Collective Fleet Captain Morthek shows green status, but he reports that hegemony vessels are targeting his assault carrier. He requests permission to take defensive action. Sarah felt the familiar cold clarity that always descended when situations spiraled completely out of control. In her years as a mediator, she'd learned that there was a point in every crisis where standard procedures became irrelevant, and you either found a way to cut through to the truth, or you watched everything burn. Both of you, listen carefully, she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. Your ship commanders are about to start a war because they're following standard military doctrine in a situation that isn't standard. They see threats, they prepare for combat, the other side sees their preparations as aggressive action, and everyone starts shooting. Commander Chen, Chief Negotiator Yalseth interjected, the harmonics climbing toward frequencies that indicated acute stress. Surely you don't expect military commanders to ignore direct threats to their vessels. I expect military commanders to follow orders from their civilian leadership, Sarah replied sharply, which means that you two need to start acting like leaders instead of politicians. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's form seemed to crystallize further, her already rigid posture becoming diamond hard. Human, you forget yourself. I am a fleet admiral in service to the hegemony. I do not take orders from alien mediators. And I am a war leader of the collective, Gorthak rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of barely contained violence that made smaller beings step back. My authority comes from Thorin blood and Thorin strength. Sarah looked between them and realized that she was watching two highly trained military officers revert to the basic tribal instincts that made their species effective warriors but terrible diplomats. Under stress, the crystallines became rigid and hierarchical, while the Thorins became aggressive and territorial. Both reactions were perfectly natural and completely counterproductive. Fine, Sarah said, moving to the central console and activating the station's emergency command override. Since you're both too worried about your authority to prevent a war, let me exercise some human authority. She opened a direct channel to both fleets, bypassing the formal diplomatic protocols that required approval from the ambassadors. This is Commander Sarah Chen, acting under emergency mediation authority granted by the Galactic Council. I am ordering all vessels to stand down and withdraw to minimum safe distance immediately. The response was immediate and predictably hostile. Fleet Commander Sithara's voice came through the speakers like breaking crystal. Human mediator, you have no authority over hegemony military assets. We are responding to direct threats from collective forces. Fleet Captain Morthek's reply followed closely. Collective vessels will not withdraw while facing crystalline targeting systems. We stand ready to defend ourselves against aggression. Sarah closed her eyes and made a decision that would either save millions of lives or get her court-martialed by half a dozen different legal systems. Both fleets be advised that I am invoking Protocol 7 under the Emergency Intervention Clause of the Galactic Peace Accords. The silence that followed was absolute.
Protocol 7 was humanity's nuclear option in diplomatic crises, a clause that had been added to the Galactic Peace Accords after the Zephyrian blockade incident.
It gave human mediators extraordinary emergency powers, but using it meant accepting personal responsibility for the consequences of whatever happened next. Commander Chen, Fleet Admiral Kethmore said carefully, Protocol 7 requires that human authorities accept full liability for any results of the intervention. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Sarah looked at the tactical display showing two fleets that were perhaps 10 minutes from opening fire on each other. I'm prepared to accept responsibility for preventing a war that will kill 47 million beings over a dispute about rocks that neither side actually needs. She turned back to the communications console. Both fleets, under Protocol 7 authority, I am declaring this entire system a temporary humanitarian zone. Any vessel that fires weapons will be considered in violation of Galactic Peace Accords and subject to immediate human intervention. What intervention? Fleet Commander Sithara demanded. Humans have no military assets in this system. Sarah smiled, and it was not a particularly pleasant expression. Fleet Commander, how familiar are you with human military doctrine?
Irrelevant, came the crystalline reply.
Human vessels are not present. Human vessels are not required, Sarah said calmly. Computer, please display the current position of the human merchant vessel, reasonable expectation. The tactical display updated to show a small cargo ship that had been docked at Kepler Station's commercial section throughout the entire crisis. To anyone looking at it, the reasonable expectation appeared to be exactly what its registration claimed, a mid-range cargo hauler with standard commercial drives and minimal defensive systems. A merchant vessel, Fleet Captain Morthek said dismissively. It poses no threat to military assets. Computer, please access the reasonable expectations actual cargo manifest and crew complement. The display updated again, and Sarah watched both military commanders realize what they were actually looking at. The reasonable expectation was registered as a cargo vessel, but its hold contained 6 Mark 7 fusion warheads and a full deployment team of human combat engineers. Its crew included 2 former human fleet admirals and a tactical specialist who had been involved in the siege of Proxima Station. The cargo ship is a disguised warship, Fleet Admiral Kethmore said, her voice carrying harmonics that Sarah recognized as genuine respect mixed with alarm. The cargo ship is a cargo ship, Sarah corrected. It just happens to be carrying cargo that can turn both of your fleets into expanding clouds of plasma. And it happens to be crewed by humans who are very good at making that happen. War leader Gorthak leaned forward, studying the display with the kind of intense focus that his species brought to potential threats. Human military doctrine permits the deployment of weapons of mass destruction through civilian vessels. Human military doctrine permits whatever achieves the objective with minimum casualties, Sarah replied. Captain Morrison, are you monitoring this channel? I'm here, Commander, came the familiar voice of the shuttle pilot who had brought them to the station. Just want to confirm that you're authorizing me to implement Option Delta if any vessel initiates hostile action. Sarah took a deep breath. Option Delta was why humanity had earned its reputation throughout the galaxy. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't diplomatic, and it wasn't remotely subtle. It was devastatingly effective. That's affirmative, Captain. You are authorized to implement Option Delta in response to any weapons fire from any vessel in this system. Understood, Commander. All targets have been acquired and firing solutions are locked. The communications channel fell silent as both fleet commanders processed what they had just heard. Sarah could see them running tactical calculations, trying to figure out how a single cargo ship could threaten multiple military vessels simultaneously. Fleet Admiral Kethmore was the first to understand. The fusion warheads. They are not intended for use against our vessels. No, Sarah confirmed. They're intended for use against the asteroids you're fighting over. The implications hit both fleets simultaneously. If Captain Morrison detonated 6 fusion warheads in the disputed asteroid field, the resulting explosion would create a debris field that would make space combat in the region impossible for decades. It would also render the asteroids completely worthless to both civilizations. You would destroy the very resources we are negotiating over? War Leader Gorthak asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. I would remove the excuse you're using to justify killing each other, Sarah replied. If the asteroids don't exist, you can't fight over them. If you can't fight over them, we can focus on the real issues that brought you here. Fleet Commander Cythera's voice came through the comm channel with crystalline clarity. Human mediator, such an action would constitute destruction of sovereign territory claimed by the hegemony. Fleet Commander, such an action would constitute removal of the excuse you're using to start a war that your own admiralty knows you can't win. Sarah shot back. I've read your tactical assessments. The hegemony gives itself a 37% chance of achieving strategic objectives in a conflict with the collective. The collective rates their own chances at 41%. Those aren't odds that anyone should be willing to die for. Fleet Captain Morthek's growl came through the speakers like distant thunder. Commander Chen, the collective does not respond well to threats. Captain Morthek, this isn't a threat, Sarah said. This is me explaining the reality of your situation. You can either negotiate a solution that gets everyone what they actually need, or you can watch me remove the thing you're pretending to fight over and then explain to your governments why you lost a war over nothing. The tactical display showed both fleets holding their positions, weapon systems still charged, but no longer cycling through targeting sequences. Sarah could see the moment when training and doctrine gave way to simple common sense. Fleet Admiral Kethmore, she continued, what do you actually need from this dispute? The crystalline commander was quiet for a long moment. Assurance that collective expansion will not threaten core hegemony systems. War Leader Gorthak, same question. Assurance that the hegemony will not use legal technicalities to prevent legitimate collective expansion. Sarah nodded. So both of you need the same thing, predictable rules for future expansion that don't involve pointing weapons at each other. The asteroids are irrelevant. They're just the excuse you're using because neither side wants to admit that you're actually arguing about fear. She turned back to the communications console. Both fleets, you have 2 minutes to begin withdrawal to minimum safe distance, or I will authorize Captain Morrison to eliminate the source of this conflict permanently. After that, we can negotiate like civilized beings instead of like territorial animals fighting over scraps. The next 90 seconds passed in absolute silence. Sarah watched the tactical displays, her hand hovering over the authorization control that would turn the disputed territory into an expanding cloud of radioactive vapor. Then, slowly, both fleets began to withdraw. Fleet Admiral Cathmore was the first to speak. Human mediator, the hegemony fleet is standing down. We are prepared to resume negotiations. War Leader Gorthak's voice followed. Collective vessels are withdrawing to safe distance. We will hear your proposals. Sarah felt her legs go weak with relief, but she kept her voice steady. Excellent. Both delegations will remain in the conference room while we work out an agreement that addresses your actual concerns instead of your imaginary grievances. Captain Morrison, maintain readiness but hold authorization for Option Delta. Understood, Commander. Standing by. As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah realized that she had just prevented a war by threatening to make the war impossible to fight. It was exactly the kind of brutally practical solution that had earned humanity its reputation as galactic mediators. More importantly, she had forced both sides to admit what they were really afraid of, which meant that for the first time since the dispute began, they could actually start addressing their real problems instead of the elaborate justifications they had constructed to avoid admitting those problems existed. The hard work was just beginning. The immediate crisis had passed, but Sarah could feel the tension in the conference room like a living thing. Both delegations sat in their respective positions, the reality of how close they had come to mutual annihilation settling into their minds like acid. The holographic display still showed the disputed asteroids, but now everyone in the room understood that those rocks had become irrelevant the moment Captain Morrison had armed 6 fusion warheads.
Sarah remained standing at the central console, her posture deliberately casual despite the weight of what she had just done.
Invoking Protocol 7 meant that her actions would be reviewed by the Galactic Council, the Human Diplomatic Corps, and probably half a dozen oversight committees. If her gambit failed to produce a lasting solution, her career would be over, and humanity's reputation as mediators would be severely damaged. More importantly, 47 million beings were still one miscommunication away from death. Before we continue, Sarah said, I need both delegations to understand something about what just happened. I didn't threaten to destroy those asteroids to force you into compliance. I threatened to destroy them to remove the excuse you were using to avoid addressing your real concerns. End of. Why? Fleet Admiral Kethmore's crystalline form remained rigid, but Sarah could detect subtle harmonic shifts that indicated deep thought. Commander, you speak of our real concerns as if our territorial integrity is somehow false. Your territorial integrity is absolutely real, Sarah agreed. But those asteroids have nothing to do with territorial integrity. They're a symbol you're using to represent deeper fears about your civilization's long-term security. She manipulated the display to show a timeline of hegemony expansion over the past 3 centuries. Look at your actual expansion pattern. The crystalline hegemony has established colonies in 47 systems over 300 years. Every single one of those colonies was chosen for specific crystal formation environments that support your technology base. War leader Gorthak studied the projection with the kind of attention his species gave to potential threats. The hegemony expansion has been systematic and methodical. They do not establish colonies randomly. Exactly, Sarah said, which means that their fear of collective expansion isn't really about territory. It's about predictability. The hegemony has spent centuries building a civilization based on careful planning and controlled growth. The collective's expansion pattern appears random and aggressive because it follows different logic. She shifted the display to show Thorin expansion over the same period. The collective has established colonies in 63 systems over the past 2 centuries. To crystalline observers, this looks like rapid, threatening expansion. But look at the actual resources in those systems. The display highlighted the strategic materials that had driven collective expansion: heavy metals, rare earth elements, energy sources, and industrial raw materials. Each colony had been established to support specific manufacturing requirements or to provide strategic resources that the Thorin economy needed. The collective isn't expanding randomly, Sarah continued. They're following industrial logic. They establish colonies where they can extract resources that support their manufacturing base. The problem is that their expansion pattern looks unpredictable to species that prioritize different strategic considerations. Chief Negotiator Yalsad's harmonic shifted to frequencies that Sarah recognized as confusion mixed with interest. Are you suggesting that our strategic assessments have been inaccurate? I'm suggesting that your strategic assessments have been based on the assumption that the collective thinks like the hegemony, Sarah replied. They don't. They prioritize immediate resource acquisition over long-term territorial control. That makes them appear aggressive when they're actually being pragmatic. Economic Minister Thexara leaned forward, her massive frame causing her chair to creak ominously. Commander Chen, you describe collective expansion as purely economic. This ignores the military implications of our colonial networks. Does it? Sarah asked. Show me the military implications. She called up a new display showing the defensive capabilities of both civilizations' colonial networks. The results were illuminating in ways that neither side had apparently considered. Crystalline colonies are positioned to create overlapping defensive zones that protect core hegemony space, Sarah observed. Each colonial system can provide mutual support to adjacent systems, creating a layered defense network. It's elegant, efficient, and designed for long-term strategic stability. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's posture showed what Sarah had learned to recognize as professional pride. Hegemony military doctrine prioritizes defensive depth and strategic stability. Right. Now look at collective colonial networks. The display shifted to highlight Thorin defensive arrangements. Collective colonies are positioned to protect resource extraction and manufacturing operations. Each colonial system is essentially self-sufficient and designed to continue operations even if cut off from central support. War leader Gorth Axe studied the projection with obvious interest. Independent operational capability is fundamental to collective military doctrine. Exactly. Which means that collective expansion doesn't threaten hegemony strategic depth, and hegemony defensive networks don't threaten collective resource independence. Your civilizations have built complementary strategic architectures without realizing it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier hostility. Sarah could see both delegations processing the implications of what she had shown them. They had spent months preparing for war based on strategic assumptions that were simply wrong. Commander, Chief Negotiator Yalseth said carefully, you suggest that our civilization's expansion patterns are naturally compatible. This contradicts decades of strategic planning by both sides. Your strategic planning has been based on incomplete information, Sarah said bluntly. Both civilizations have been planning as if the other side thought exactly like they do. Crystallines assumed that collective expansion was designed to create territorial control networks. Taurans assumed that hegemony colonies were positioned to project military power. Both assumptions are wrong. She returned to the central console and pulled up a new projection, a map showing optimal expansion routes for both civilizations over the next century, based on their actual strategic priorities rather than their fears about each other's intentions. If both civilizations continue expanding according to their natural patterns, hegemony seeking crystal formation environments, collective seeking manufacturing resources, your territories will overlap in exactly 3 systems over the next 100 years. 3 systems, out of more than 200 that both civilizations are likely to colonize. War leader Gorth Axe expression shifted to what Sarah recognized as genuine surprise. 3 systems. This projection accounts for resource depletion and technological advancement? It accounts for everything, Sarah confirmed. Known resource distributions, technological development trends, population growth projections, economic expansion patterns. I had the Galactic Council's best analysts run the models. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's harmonics had dropped to frequencies that indicated deep concentration. Commander, these projections assume that both civilizations will continue following their current strategic patterns. What if those patterns change? Sarah nodded approvingly. Excellent question. What if they change? What would cause the hegemony to abandon crystal farming in favor of territorial expansion? The crystalline admiral considered the question seriously. Fundamental disruption to our technological base, loss of crystal formation capability, direct threat to core systems. And what would cause the collective to shift from resource-focused expansion to territorial conquest? Industrial-based destruction, war leader Gorth. Act replied after a moment's thought. Loss of manufacturing capability. Economic collapse requiring territorial acquisition for survival. Sarah gestured to both delegations. So both civilizations would only abandon their current strategic patterns if they faced existential threats to their fundamental survival. Which means that as long as both civilizations remain stable and prosperous, their expansion patterns will remain naturally compatible. She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. The only thing that could force either civilization into threatening the other's strategic interests would be a catastrophic war that destroyed their ability to follow their preferred development patterns. Economic Minister Thexara's massive hands clenched slowly into fists. You are saying that the war we almost fought would have created the very threat conditions we were trying to prevent. Exactly. By going to war to prevent each other from becoming threats, you would have guaranteed that you actually became threats to each other. The conference room fell into a silence so complete that Sarah could hear the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Both delegations stared at the projections with expressions of beings who had just realized they had been about to commit civilizational suicide over a misunderstanding. Chief Negotiator Yalseth was the first to speak. Commander Chen, if these analyses are correct, then our dispute over the asteroid field is meaningless. It's worse than meaningless, Sarah replied. It's actively counterproductive. Fighting over those asteroids wouldn't give either civilization anything they actually need, but it would destabilize the region enough to disrupt both civilizations' actual expansion plans. She manipulated the display to show the aftermath of various conflict scenarios. A limited war over the asteroids delays hegemony expansion by at least 2 decades and forces the collective to shift resources from colony development to military production. A full-scale war destroys so much infrastructure that both civilizations would need to focus on rebuilding rather than expanding. Fleet Admiral Kethmore's form had taken on the crystalline stillness that indicated deep consideration. You are saying that fighting for these resources would prevent us from accessing the resources we actually need. I'm saying that fighting over anything would prevent both civilizations from achieving their actual strategic objectives.
Sarah corrected. The dispute isn't really about the asteroids.
It's about fear. Fear that the other side will become a threat. Fear that your own civilization's growth will be constrained. Fear that you'll lose something important if you don't fight for it. War leader Gorthak leaned back in his chair, which groaned under the redistribution of his massive weight. Human mediator, you speak of fear as if it is unreasonable. Both civilizations have legitimate security concerns.
You absolutely do, Sarah agreed.
But you're addressing those legitimate security concerns by doing things that make you less secure. It's like, imagine you're afraid of falling off a cliff, so you start running toward the edge to get away from the cliff. The analogy earned her several confused looks, so she tried a different approach. Both civilizations are trying to solve long-term strategic problems with short-term tactical solutions. You're so focused on preventing future threats that you're creating immediate dangers. She returned to the central console and activated a new display, a comprehensive framework for managing intercivilizational expansion that the human diplomatic corps had developed based on decades of successful mediations. Here's what I propose, Sarah said. Instead of fighting over territory that neither of you actually needs, establish a permanent framework for managing future expansion that addresses both civilizations' actual strategic requirements. The framework appeared on the main display as a complex web of treaties, monitoring systems, economic agreements, and conflict resolution mechanisms. It was designed to provide both civilizations with the predictability they needed, while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. This framework would give the hegemony the strategic stability they need to continue their expansion pattern, Sarah explained. It would give the collective the resource access they need to maintain their industrial development, and it would provide both civilizations with early warning systems that would prevent the kind of misunderstandings that almost started a war today. Fleet Admiral Kethmore studied the framework with obvious interest. Commander, such an agreement would require both civilizations to share sensitive strategic information.
Yes, Sarah said.
It would require both civilizations to trust each other enough to be honest about their actual intentions instead of their assumed intentions. Economic Minister Thexara's expression showed what Sarah recognized as cautious optimism. Such frameworks exist between other civilizations? Dozens of them, Sarah confirmed. The Zephyrian Cooperative and the Alterian Federation have been using a similar framework for over a century. The Centauri Alliance has mutual expansion agreements with 6 different species. These systems work when both sides are willing to be honest about what they actually need. War leader Gorthak was quiet for a long moment, studying the projections with the kind of intense focus that his species brought to critical decisions. When he spoke, his voice carried a note that Sarah had never heard from a Thoran before, something that might have been hope. Commander Chen, you believe that our civilizations can achieve their expansion objectives without threatening each other? Sarah looked around the conference room at the assembled representatives of 2 ancient civilizations who had spent months preparing to destroy each other over rocks they didn't need. War leader, I believe that your civilizations have been so focused on protecting themselves from imaginary threats that you've lost sight of your actual objectives. I believe that once you remember what you're actually trying to accomplish, you'll realize that cooperation serves your interests better than conflict. She paused and allowed herself a small smile. I also believe that both of your civilizations are smart enough to recognize a good deal when they see one. And this framework represents a very good deal for everyone involved. The real negotiation was about to begin. 6 hours later, Sarah Chen sat in the station's medical bay, watching Dr. Kelleth, the crystalline station physician, examine Ambassador Zaxalthara's arm with the kind of careful attention that suggested serious injury. The ambassador had suffered what appeared to be a compound fracture during the evacuation to the secure sections when the military crisis had reached its peak. The delicate crystalline structure of her forearm showed a clean break that had shifted the alignment of her entire lower arm. The fracture has displaced the harmonic resonance chambers, Dr. Kelleth explained in the musical tones that characterize crystalline medical discourse. Without proper realignment, Ambassador Zexaltahara will suffer permanent loss of her harmonic communication abilities. Sarah watched as the doctor activated various sophisticated medical devices, bone knitters, cellular regenerators, harmonic alignment scanners that cost more than most starships. All of them showed the same result. The fracture was too complex for automated repair systems to handle safely. The displacement has created micro-fractures throughout the resonance matrix, Dr. Kelleth continued, her own harmonics reflecting deep concern. Our surgical protocols require a 6-hour procedure with neural interface guidance to properly reconstruct the damaged structures. Ambassador Zeltathara lay on the medical table with the kind of perfect stillness that characterized crystalline pain management. But Sarah could see the fine stress fractures appearing in the ambassador's shoulder crystals, a clear sign that the injury was causing significant systemic distress. 6 hours, Sarah said. How long does she have before the damage becomes permanent? Crystalline harmonic structures begin to set in their displaced positions after approximately 40 minutes. Dr. Will, Kelleth replied. We have perhaps 37 minutes before surgical intervention becomes significantly more complex. Sarah checked her chronometer. They had been in the medical bay for 11 minutes, which meant that the ambassador had perhaps 26 minutes before her injury became a permanent disability. The problem was that Dr. Kid Kelleth was the only qualified crystalline surgeon within 3 days' travel, and he was currently dealing with a cascade failure in his primary surgical suite caused by the emergency power fluctuations during the military crisis. Doctor, what are the alternatives? Doctor?
Kelleth's harmonic shifted to frequencies that Sarah's cultural training identified as professional frustration mixed with helplessness.
Without proper surgical facilities, the only option would be manual reduction of the fracture.
However, crystalline bone structure requires precise pressure application that exceeds most species' fine motor control capabilities. Manual reduction means setting the bone by hand? Essentially, yes. The displaced fragments must be physically repositioned and held in proper alignment while the harmonic resonance chambers are recalibrated. It requires extraordinary precision and strength. The ability to apply exact pressure at multiple points simultaneously while maintaining perfect stability. Sarah looked at Ambassador Zaxelthara's injured arm, studying the way the fracture had displaced the crystalline structures. Her diplomatic training included basic xenobiology for all major species, and she understood enough about crystalline physiology to recognize the complexity of what Dr. Physics Kelleth was describing. The bone fragments would need to be moved with millimeter precision while maintaining their harmonic alignment, like tuning a dozen musical instruments simultaneously while rebuilding them. Doctor, what species would have the fine motor control necessary for manual reduction? Dr. Kelleth considered the question seriously. The Altarians possess sufficient dexterity but lack the strength. The Centauri have the strength, but their manipulator appendages are too large for precision work. Theoretically, a being with both human-level fine motor control and significantly enhanced strength could perform the procedure. Sarah felt a familiar chill as she realized what the doctor was suggesting. You're talking about humans. Human manual dexterity is exceptional among known species, Dr. Kelleth confirmed. However, human strength limitations would normally prevent the kind of pressure application required for crystalline bone manipulation. Sarah looked at Ambassador Zaxelthara's injury again, her mind racing through the implications of what she was considering. Manual bone setting was a technique that human medics had used for centuries before the development of advanced surgical equipment. It required strength, precision, and a thorough understanding of bone structure and joint mechanics. It also required the willingness to cause tremendous pain in order to provide healing. Doctor, could you walk me through the procedure? Doctor. Kelleth's harmonic shifted to frequencies that Sarah recognized as profound surprise. Commander Chen, you cannot seriously be considering manual reduction of a crystalline fracture. The strength requirements alone. Doctor, I've read the emergency medical protocols. In crisis situations, human medics are authorized to attempt procedures outside their normal training if they represent the only viable treatment option.
Sarah moved to the medical scanner and began studying the detailed images of the ambassador's injury.
You said the fragments need to be repositioned with precise pressure.
Show me exactly what needs to be done. For the next 5 minutes, Dr. Kelleth provided a detailed explanation of crystalline bone structure, harmonic resonance chambers, and the specific manipulations required to properly reduce the fracture. Sarah absorbed the information with the kind of focused intensity that had made her effective as a mediator. The ability to understand complex systems quickly and identify the critical points where precise action could solve seemingly impossible problems. The key challenge, Dr. Kelleth explained, is that the primary fragment must be rotated exactly 17 degrees while being compressed at 3 specific pressure points. Simultaneously, the secondary fragment must be lifted and shifted to restore proper alignment. The forces required exceed normal human capability. Sarah studied the scanner images, visualizing the procedure in her mind. Doctor, what would happen if someone applied too much pressure during the reduction? Catastrophic fragmentation of the entire resonance chamber array. Ambassador Zaxelthara would lose all harmonic communication permanently and suffer severe neural damage. And if someone applied too little pressure, the fragments would not properly seat. The fracture would heal incorrectly, resulting in permanent disability and chronic harmonic distortion. Sarah nodded and moved to the medical table where Ambassador Zaxelthara lay in crystalline stillness. Ambassador, I need you to understand what I'm about to propose. Dr. Kelleth cannot perform surgical repair because his equipment is damaged. I can attempt manual reduction, but it will be extremely painful and there's a significant risk of making your injury worse. Ambassador Zaxelthara's harmonics were barely audible, but Sarah caught the underlying tones that indicated determined acceptance. Commander Chen, how significant is the risk? Sarah looked at Dr. Kelleth, who consulted his medical scanner before responding. Improper manual reduction could result in total harmonic communication loss and significant neural damage. Proper manual reduction would restore approximately 90 to 5% of normal function. And no treatment, permanent harmonic disability within 23 minutes. Ambassador Zexalthara was quiet for a moment, her harmonics cycling through frequencies that Sarah recognized as rapid calculation and decision-making.
Commander, I understand that you are not trained in crystalline medicine.
Why do you believe you can perform this procedure? Sarah positioned herself next to the medical table and carefully examined the ambassador's injured arm.
Because, Ambassador, my species has a saying, desperate times call for desperate measures.
And because sometimes the only way to fix something is to break it properly first, she looked at Dr. Kelleth. Doctor, I need you to guide me through each step. Tell me exactly where to apply pressure, how much force to use, and what to watch for if I'm making a mistake. Commander Chen.
Dr. Kelleth protested. This is an extremely dangerous procedure. If you apply incorrect pressure, Doctor... Sarah interrupted. In 18 minutes, Ambassador Zexalthara is going to lose her harmonic abilities permanently, whether I try this or not.
At least this way, she has a chance. She turned back to the ambassador. This is going to hurt. Crystalline pain responses are different from human ones, but pain is pain. I need you to remain as still as possible and tell me immediately if something feels wrong. Ambassador Zexalthara's harmonic shifted to the frequency that indicated formal consent. Commander, I place my trust in your abilities. Sarah took a deep breath and positioned her hands on either side of the fracture site. Under Dr. Kelleth's guidance, she located the primary pressure points and began to apply gentle force to assess the resistance of the displaced bone fragments. The primary fragment requires rotation and compression, Dr. Kelleth instructed. Begin with minimal pressure and increase gradually until you feel the fragment begin to shift. Sarah applied pressure with her right hand while supporting the damaged area with her left. The crystalline bone structure was unlike anything human medics normally dealt with, harder than calcium-based bones but with natural fracture lines that could be used to guide manipulation if you understood the harmonic stresses involved. More pressure, Doctor, Kelleth said, monitoring his scanner readings. The fragment is beginning to rotate but needs additional force to overcome the harmonic resistance. Sarah increased the pressure, feeling the bone fragment shift slightly under her fingers. Ambassador Zexalthara's harmonics rose to frequencies that clearly indicated significant pain, but she remained perfectly still. Now compress the secondary pressure points while maintaining the rotation, Dr. Kelleth instructed. This will require significant force, approximately twice what you are currently applying. Sarah gritted her teeth and applied more pressure. The sensation was like trying to bend titanium with her bare hands. The crystalline structure resisted her efforts with stubborn persistence. She could feel the moment when the bone fragment reached its resistance threshold and began to move. Ambassador Zexalthara's harmonics suddenly spiked to frequencies that made every being in the medical bay wince. "You beast!" she cried, the universal translator converting her harmonic shriek into words that carried all the pain and shock of the procedure. "You're breaking me apart." Sarah didn't pause or reduce pressure. "I'm putting you back together," she said grimly, feeling the bone fragment click into its proper position. "Doctor, is the primary fragment correctly aligned?" Dr. Kelleth checked his scanner, his own harmonics reflecting amazement. "Yes, perfect alignment. Now you must lift and reposition the secondary fragment while maintaining pressure on the primary." The next part of the procedure was even more complex. Sarah had to use her left hand to lift the displaced bone fragment, while her right hand continued applying pressure to keep the primary fragment in position. The amount of force required was at the very edge of human capability, and she could feel her muscles beginning to shake from the strain. "Lift the fragment another 2 millimeters, Dr. Kelleth instructed. "Now shift it laterally while maintaining the vertical position." Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead as she manipulated the crystalline bone structure with a precision that her diplomatic training had never prepared her for. This was raw, physical problem-solving, using human strength and dexterity to accomplish something that medical technology couldn't handle. "Perfect," Dr. Kelleth announced. "The harmonic resonance chambers are realigning. Maintain current pressure while the structures settle into position." For the next 60 seconds, Sarah held Ambassador Zexalthara's arm in a grip that would have crushed human bones, but was exactly what the crystalline structure needed to heal properly. She could feel the bone fragments finding their natural alignment, the harmonic chambers resonating in harmony as their proper relationships were restored. "Release pressure gradually, Dr. Kelleth instructed. "Allow the structures to support themselves as you reduce the external force. Sarah slowly relaxed her grip, ready to reapply pressure if the fragments began to shift. But the bone held its position, the harmonic chambers maintaining their alignment as the natural healing processes began to take effect. Kelleth ran a complete scan, his harmonics rising to frequencies that indicated professional joy, perfect reduction. The harmonic resonance chambers are functioning at 97% of normal capacity. Ambassador Zixalthara will experience full recovery within 72 hours. Sarah stepped back from the medical table, her hands shaking from the physical strain of the procedure. Ambassador Zixalthara lay still for a moment, then slowly moved her arm, testing the restored functionality. "Commander Chen," the ambassador said, her harmonics now carrying tones of wonder and gratitude. I apologize for calling you a beast. I did not understand what you were doing." Sarah smiled and sank into a nearby chair, exhaustion finally hitting her. "Ambassador, sometimes healing requires a controlled form of violence. Sometimes you have to break something properly before you can fix it right." She looked around the medical bay at the assembled beings who had witnessed the procedure. Dr. Kelleth was updating his medical records with obvious fascination. Several other station personnel had gathered to observe, their expressions showing a mixture of amazement and unease. "What you just did," Dr. Kelleth said carefully, "should not have been possible. The precision required, the strength necessary, the ability to cause pain in order to provide healing, these are not traits that most species can reconcile." Sarah nodded, understanding what the doctor was really saying. She had just demonstrated exactly why humanity had earned its reputation as galactic mediators. Humans had the unique ability to do terrible things for good reasons, to cause immediate pain in order to prevent greater suffering. "Doctor," she said, "my species has learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is also the most violent thing. Sometimes mercy looks like cruelty from the outside." She turned to Ambassador Zixalthara, who was now sitting up and testing her arm's full range of motion. "Ambassador, I hope you'll remember this when you're finalizing the expansion framework agreement. Both of our civilizations sometimes need to do things that look threatening in order to achieve peaceful outcomes." Ambassador Zixalthara's harmonics carried frequencies that Sarah had never heard before. A complex mixture of respect, gratitude, and something that might have been affection. "Commander Chen, I will never forget that you were willing to hurt me in order to heal me. This is a lesson that applies to more than just medical procedures." As word of the bone-setting incident spread through the station, Sarah realized that she had accidentally provided both civilizations with a perfect metaphor for their entire situation. Sometimes peace required actions that looked like violence. Sometimes healing meant being willing to cause temporary pain. Sometimes the most merciful thing you could do was also the most terrifying. And sometimes, when diplomacy failed and technology couldn't solve the problem, what you needed was a human willing to get their hands dirty and do whatever was necessary to fix what was broken. 3 days later, the hegemony and the collective signed the most comprehensive interspecies cooperation agreement in galactic history. The disputed asteroids were designated as a joint research facility. Both civilizations agreed to share expansion planning information and establish permanent communication protocols to prevent future misunderstandings. Sarah Chen returned to Earth with a commendation from the Galactic Council and a new reputation throughout known space. They called her the Bone Mender, the human who could break things with her bare hands and put them back together better than they had been before. But she preferred to think of herself simply as a diplomat who understood that sometimes the most important negotiations happened not around conference tables, but in moments when someone was brave enough to do the right thing, regardless of how it looked to observers. The galaxy was a safer place because Sarah Chen had been willing to break an ambassador's arm in order to heal it. And more importantly, it was a more peaceful place because she had shown 2 ancient civilizations that sometimes the most frightening display of power was also the greatest act of mercy. In the end, that was what made humans effective mediators throughout the galaxy. Not their wisdom, not their technology, not their diplomatic skills, but their willingness to do whatever was necessary to solve the problem in front of them, regardless of how it might appear to others. Sometimes the beast and the healer were the same person, using the same hands to accomplish the same goal. And sometimes that was exactly what the universe needed.